Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Can Monarchs Commit Crimes, 1648 to 1649 by Historia Civilis. So, judging by those years in the title, and that the next video is the trial of Charles I, I'm assuming this video is going to be about the English Civil War and Charles I. Now, last time we did Can Animals Commit Crimes, so we're sort of on this natural progression from animals to monarchs. Maybe not natural, but still a progression upwards. If you're wondering where the reaction to the Battle of Agincourt is, that is going to go up probably in a couple of weeks for patrons and channel members. So if you want to see that one, plus a bunch of other exclusive Historia Civilis reactions, please check out the Patreon or our channel membership program. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
I want to talk about one of the most important trials, human trials, in the history of the planet. It took place in January of the year.
I would say so. That is probably a fair characterization of this trial. I'll begin this by saying that, the English Civil War is not necessarily my area of expertise. I have a lot to learn on the topic, but I know more about this than I do about medieval animal trials. So, judge that as you will.
Year 1649, before a newly created body called the High Court of Justice. The charges: tyranny, treason, and murder. The defendant: the King of England.
Alright, I'm excited to see this one.
This trial helped to write the legal doctrine of popular sovereignty, which is the idea that political legitimacy emanates from the people.
Yeah, and the English Civil War, this trial, a lot of the trends that began with the English Civil War will be really influential on Britain, but also the world as a whole. For example, if we look at American history, I'm an American, a lot of American politics, the American push for independence, the founders, a lot of these people and these events took cues from the radicalism of the English Civil War. So really, the political repercussions of this event would be very wide-ranging and wouldn't be felt just in this time period. They would continue to be felt over a long period of time.
It's a simple idea, but it stood in stark contrast with another legal doctrine, which argued that political legitimacy emanated from God through the institution of monarchy. This was called divine right.
Yes, and, we're in the mid-1600s. Divine right is really the main ideology of this era. Most monarchs, and at this point we're entering, or frankly, we're firmly in the era of absolute monarchy. A lot of these monarchs are really centralizing power in many different European countries, and they claim that their right comes from God, their right to rule. Now, this comes into contrast with another idea, popular sovereignty, that leaders, kings, get their right to rule from the people. Now, in the long term, popular sovereignty is going to become far more popular and accepted than divine right. I mean, just look at the next couple centuries of European history. Constitutional monarchies, democracies in some cases, so this idea becomes very popular. But in the mid-1600s, this is really the height of divine right and absolute monarchy.
Generally speaking, these two ideas stood in opposition to each other. Popular sovereignty was bottom-up, divine right was top-down. This theoretical disagreement over the source of political legitimacy resulted in several centuries of troubles. And one of these troubles was the thing called the English Civil War.
Yes, and of course, if you're an absolute monarch who holds that their right to rule is granted by God, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be a bad ruler. I mean, you might even be a ruler that does things for the people. It's just that you believe your right to rule does not come from the people, so you have no obligation to listen to the people. Now, you might still listen to them, but you don't have to. And so that can also lead to a lot of problems, tyrants, bad monarchs. Doesn't necessarily have to, but it does.
The capstone to the English Civil War was that thing I want to talk about. The trial of Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Trial of the century.
And of course, this is before the Act of Union. when, Britain, the British Isles were unified as the United Kingdom. First, we have the unification of England, Wales, and Scotland, and then Ireland gets brought into the picture a little bit later. That won't happen until the 18th century. At this point, we have England, Scotland, and Ireland, but as you can see, we have one guy who's king of all three countries. So we already see this process of these countries being brought together under one man and one government, but it will only be formalized a bit later.
He doesn't begin to describe it. This would be the trial of the millennia. But in order to fully appreciate what was to come...
Of the millennia? That is quite a big claim to make, but if you look at the influence it had, you can think of other prominent kings who ended up executed, like Louis XVI in France. Well, the legislators, the French revolutionaries, and Louis were all looking back on this trial when that was happening. So if you frame it like that, then, this is truly an influential trial.
Some context is required. The English Civil War is notoriously complex. Some would say boring, but I would say complex. I promise to be brief. King Charles I, separately and simultaneously the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, believed that...
And he pointed it out there, separately and simultaneously. Highlight on the separately. So he was king of these three countries at the same time, but these were technically separate positions. Though, like I said, of course, these countries were sort of slowly growing closer together and would eventually be unified.
Political legitimacy emanated from God and manifested through the crown, divine right.
Yep.
A consequence of this belief is that Charles saw other sources of political power as a diminishment of his own royal authority.
Yeah, and we're going to see that this is the big issue with Charles. Now, Britain, or England in particular, for a while had a fairly strong parliament, right? We have this system where, of course, you have a king at the top who is very powerful, but Parliament also has a lot of say in how the country is governed. Charles does not like that. He wants to basically turn his monarchy into an absolute monarchy. He wants to do what, for example, someone like Louis XIV did in France. Louis XIV grew up in a France that was rife with political chaos. The nobles had a lot of power, and they sort of pushed the king around. And so, what did Louis do? Well, he increased his power, and he brought the aristocracy to heel. He really developed this very strong absolute monarchy where he had almost complete power. Charles wants to do exactly the same thing in England, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Britain. Of course, Parliament very much doesn't want that, so we sort of reach this conflict.
He therefore did everything in his power to reign without ever consulting with Parliament.
Yeah.
This was tricky, because without the consent of Parliament, you couldn't tax the people of England. To compensate for this, the king raised revenue in a number of creative ways.
And as you can see, this was an unusual thing, because the king would usually have to go through Parliament in order to tax the people. I think sometimes sort of the popular view of, say, this time period, or before this time period, if we look at, say, the Middle Ages, is this era of monarchs with a lot of power. And in some way, that's true, but if we look at monarchs, particularly before the 1600s, before this era of absolute monarchy, a lot of these monarchs are relatively weak throughout Europe. They have to work through their aristocracy in order to get anything done, and this is just as true for Britain as other places in Europe. As I've said, the new trend of this century is absolute monarchy, best exemplified in Louis XIV. And someone like Charles, he wants to move away from the tradition where he has to work through Parliament and towards a system where he has the power all in his own hands. But that creates a lot of problems.
Such as diverting money that was intended for the Navy, as well as arbitrarily demanding loans from the nobility and throwing them in prison when they refused.
So, obviously, these aren't exactly loans. They're forced cash injections. This is just another way for Charles to raise money. He can't tax through Parliament, so he does it in other ways that, of course, are less popular than just regular taxation. This starts to make everybody really angry at him.
This was exactly as popular as you might think. In time, Scotland rose in rebellion. At last, after avoiding Parliament for 11 long years, Charles was forced to, in his eyes, diminish his royal authority by asking them for funds to raise an army. Parliament was furious. Instead of giving the king his army, they went right for the jugular. They outlawed his creative means of raising revenue, and then charged some of his closest political allies with treason.
Yeah. Now, remember I said when we look at the French Revolution, a lot of the participants, including Louis XVI, were looking back on Charles, what he had done, what the English revolutionaries had done, and Louis really should have taken some more notes because we see this situation where Charles is forced to call Parliament. He feels like he has no other option, and he thinks, well, I'm just going to call Parliament, and they're going to give me what I want after maybe some griping. That's not how it goes. Louis, in some ways, makes the same mistakes, calling up the Estates General. Okay, we just need them to pass this financial bill. We need to keep France going. What happens? Things quickly get out of control.
A short time later, Ireland rose in rebellion. Parliament then took things up a notch and tried to take control of the military away from the king. For Charles, this was the final straw. He ordered 5 of the most radical members of Parliament arrested. Parliament refused to give up their own, and there was a standoff. When they asked the local militia to seize the capital, the king fled north, and England was engulfed in a civil war.
Yep, and now you have a civil war. And to be honest, the revolts in Scotland and Ireland, this was a pretty normal thing, kind of a frequent occurrence. The unusual part of it was that Parliament would not cooperate with the king in order to put down these revolts. And Parliament and Charles clashing, this is what leads to the English Civil War.
The fighting dragged on for 4 years, leading to an unprecedented level of mobilization. The English Civil War became, and remains, the deadliest conflict in English history. Twice as deadly as World War I on a per capita basis.
And that's obviously a crazy thing to think about, but of course, if you look at English history, you know, we're talking about an island here. We're talking about the British Isles, England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And so they usually did a fairly decent job of trying to keep away from all those European conflicts. Or when they did get involved, maybe Britain would just be getting involved economically. We can look at a conflict around this same time, the 30 Years' War. This massive, catastrophic religious war in Europe primarily took place in what is today Germany that was incredibly destructive. Britain basically kept out of it. But now they're getting their own taste of conflict, and of course it's a civil war, so you have a situation where, you know, there's Englishmen on both sides. So no matter who wins and who loses, that leads to more death and destruction. So yeah, this was an incredibly big deal, incredibly sort of traumatic for the English psyche, a really big event that, like I said, would really impact English society, politics for a while to come.
An entire generation of men and women were profoundly radicalized by this event.
Yep.
Charles was eventually forced to flee up into Scottish-occupied territory, where he was captured and then handed over to Parliament. The king escaped and fled to the Isle of Wight, where he was captured for a second time. From captivity, Charles was able to convince a sympathetic Scottish army to invade England, setting off a wave of royalist uprisings across the countryside.
And you can see, by the way, why Historia Civilis describes the English Civil War as rather complicated, because we have England, we have Scotland, we have Ireland, we have multiple sides. In all of these countries, switching alliances, it becomes very, very complicated. But it seems this video is more about the trial and less about the conflict itself.
Let's pause here, because this would become an important point. After the people of England suffered World War I-sized casualties, the King of England turned around and asked another country to invade. To the already radicalized English people, angry doesn't begin to describe it. Their own king had just stabbed them in the back. At great cost, the parliamentarians fought what was basically a second civil war, eventually defeating the Scots and quelling the uprisings. That brings us up to September of the year 1648. Parliament had just won 2 civil wars, and the king was imprisoned on the Isle of Wight. The problem was that nobody knew what to do next. Parliament was made up of 2 distinct bodies, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And unsurprisingly, given the context of the Civil War, the House of Commons had been the ones driving the agenda. The Commons was split into 2 factions. The larger of the 2 was the moderate faction, who favored squeezing some religious reforms out of Charles.
By the way, it's worth remembering that when we think about the House of Commons and the House of Lords in a more modern context, we might think of, the aristocratic House of Lords and then the more populist House of Commons. But at this point in time, both are extraordinarily aristocratic. Now, the House of Commons is more radical. It's been more radicalized by this conflict. It is less friendly to the king, but we're basically talking about unfriendly aristocrats. It's very interesting to compare this conflict to, say, the French Revolution, but one of the big differences is that when we look at something like the French Revolution, we're talking about a lot of middle-class bourgeois individuals rising up. Here, we are primarily talking about aristocrats leading the charge on both sides. Just aristocrats who have a big problem with how Charles has been ruling,
reducing his political power and restoring him to the throne. The Independents, on the other hand, named after their desire for independence from the Church of England, wanted to go much further. They had a long list of demands, including a call for a brand new electoral system where poor people were actually given the right to vote. A radical idea for the time.
And this is where we sort of get to the fringes of the English Civil War. Like I said, we're mostly talking about aristocrats on both sides, but the average people of England very much did get involved. I mean, first off, we're talking about war. So who was fighting these wars? Well, a lot of the common people. And this conflict radicalized a lot of those people, got them into politics for the first time. And some of the most radicalized of those radicals would start to talk about empowering the people, some forms of democracy. Now, this was still on the fringes, right? And a lot of this would be stamped out in years to come, but some of that radicalism would survive, and we see it popping up again in British history, American history. So we have some real interesting stuff going on here.
You might notice that there was no royalist or conservative faction. The Civil War had seen to that. So the Commons were split between the moderates and the independents, with the moderates running the show. But the really interesting dynamic is that the English army was also split. The officers generally favored the moderates, while the rank and file, radicalized by the Civil War, mostly favored the independents. This made for a complicated political situation. But of course, there were heterodox views within each of these groups, especially within army leadership. Lord Fairfax was the commander-in-chief of the army, firmly in the moderate camp, favoring a negotiated settlement with the king.
And judging from his position as commander-in-chief, you probably know this, but Fairfax is one of the most influential men in this conflict and in this time period. So when we're talking about the English Civil War, Fairfax is someone you've got to keep an eye on.
Oliver Cromwell was Fairfax's second in command, and
there's another one.
Had a foot in each faction. He sided with the independents when it came to their radical...
Now, if Fairfax is one of the most important guys in this conflict, Cromwell may be the most important, second perhaps only to the king himself. Cromwell is extremely important and will become even more important down the line.
Religious reforms. He was quite religious himself, but he also sided with the moderates when it came to forcing political reforms upon the king and restoring him to the throne.
Yeah, Cromwell was a rather radical Puritan, though a lot of the Puritans were rather radical. And it's interesting when we talk about politics in England at this time, it's very much tied up with religion. So those fighting for freedom were oftentimes fighting for religious freedom in some way. A lot of the dissenters, the radicals, would have been people from dissenting religions, such as Puritans, non-Anglicans. So politics, religion, very closely tied.
Or at least that's what he had believed. The experience with the Scottish invasion had changed Cromwell, and he was no longer certain that the English people could trust their own sovereign. Henry Ireton was another high-ranking general, and Cromwell's son-in-law. Ireton favored radical political reforms, which made him an independent. He was a firebrand, and he wasn't shy about speaking out against the monarchy and the nobility. One contemporary described him as having, quote, the principles and temper of a Cassius. Cassius? We actually know what that means.
Yes. Historia Civilis got to tie it back to Roman history somehow, so this guy's a real radical, and judging from that description, he's a dangerous radical. And this is what I'm talking about when I say on the fringes. Someone like that, anti-monarchy, even anti-aristocracy in some ways. That is on the fringe. Still involved, but very, very radical.
But nothing's that simple. Despite being broadly aligned on policy, the independents in the Commons kept on denouncing Ireton for various philosophical disagreements. For example, the most radical of the radicals argued that private property was an invention of the crown, and so if the crown went away, private property should return to the hands of the people.
And we see this sort of stuff pop up from time to time. Another example we've seen was, for example, in the Sassanid Persian Empire. Basically, what we might refer to as sort of proto-communist, proto-Marxist ideas on property and redistribution. Like I said, these ideas have popped up in many different places, in many different forms. It's sort of difficult, oftentimes, to draw a comparison or draw a line between these type of ideas, but when we see political radicalization pop up, sometimes we see ideas like this pop up.
Ireton disagreed with this, which led to him perpetually being cancelled by his closest political allies.
Damn, he got cancelled.
For the time being, this fighting among the independents didn't really matter, because the House of Commons was controlled by the moderates. They decided to send representatives from each faction to the Isle of Wight to negotiate with the king. This team of negotiators was initially quite successful. They got Charles to agree that Parliament had gone to war in its just and lawful defense, which meant that everybody who had fought in the Civil War would be immune from prosecution. A big win.
And by the way, see where we're at. This is going to end up with with Charles on trial being executed. See how far we are from this. They are negotiating with him about not prosecuting those who went to war. So clearly, when they imagine the sort of post-war settlement, they imagine a system where Charles is on top and still holds a considerable amount of power. And a successful negotiation with Charles is pretty rare. I think we'll see that throughout these videos, but what has already been proven true throughout the course of the build-up to the war and the war itself is that Charles is an absolute hardliner. He refuses to negotiate, and it makes sense when you think, well, this is a man who believes that his authority comes from God, and God alone. He has no responsibility to answer to the people, to the parliament, to the aristocracy, and so unless he wants to, he usually refuses to negotiate. He is extremely stubborn, and that has very much been true throughout his reign as king.
Also got him to agree to a whole host of political reforms.
So getting him to agree to any sort of negotiation is a pretty big deal.
Parliament would be fully autonomous, with the ability to pick the king's ministers and implement their own policy.
Wow.
These were huge concessions.
Yeah.
The independents wanted radical political reforms, and it looked like they were going to get them. The moderates wanted to restore the king to the throne in a reduced capacity, and it looked like they were going to get that too. A settlement seemed within reach. But then, the negotiators made a key discovery. The king was an unreliable partner. He would make a big concession, and the next day he would take it back.
Yep.
They were forced to go over the same points again and again and again.
And this is what dealing with Charles is like.
The king seemed to be playing for time.
Yeah.
When it came to religion, the two sides could not make any progress. The negotiators, particularly the independents, wanted the Church of England to get rid of bishops and become more egalitarian. Well,
and of course the Church of England was created as sort of a separation from the Catholic Church, but In many ways, the Anglican religion, the Church of England, remained quite similar to Catholicism. It was Protestant, but it shared a lot of similarities with the hierarchical Catholic way of doing things. And so a lot of these radicals, like I said, politics was tied up with religion. If they were pushing for freedom, they were pushing for religious freedom. And so they wanted a more sort of Protestant egalitarian system of religion instead of the more hierarchical system that the Church of England had retained from the Catholic Church.
The king would not do. He would agree to a partial set of reforms that would expire after 3 years, but nothing more. This wasn't enough for the...
And of course, the king is the head of the Church of England, right? So any attempt to make the Church of England more egalitarian, he would certainly see as an attack on his power. And so he doesn't want to reform the church, he wants to keep it as it is.
Independence. A less hierarchical Church of England was central to their ideology. As discussions dragged into their second month, the negotiators began to lose hope. At one point, 2 of the moderates got down on their knees and begged the king to just give in to their demands.
Damn. I mean, you can see how desperate they were. We covered how destructive this war was. We're talking about years of political chaos that led to this massive civil war. Like I said, really traumatic for the people of the country. And so, these negotiators are just desperate to bring an end to the conflict. But they can't come to a settlement. And I'm going to put that more on Charles. Like I said, he was incredibly stubborn. As we saw here, he was unreliable. I think the negotiators, though of course they have their demands, they are trying to come to an agreement with Charles, who just refuses to budge.
These negotiations failed, they said. The army, full of bloodthirsty radicals, would have no choice but to intervene.
Yeah.
They might not bother negotiating.
Yeah, and of course that's what the moderates are worrying about. They are certainly not fans of Charles. This is why this whole thing began. They want to reduce his power, though they want to leave him in his position. But these moderates have also become afraid of a lot of their own men. As they said, a lot of the rank and file of the armed forces were quite radical at this point. And so they're worried, Charles, if you don't negotiate with us, if we can't make this work, then who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what these radicals are going to do? And, you could say they sort of saw what was coming, though it didn't take much to understand the dangerous situation that everybody was in.
While this was going on, Ireton was urging the higher-ups within the army to break off negotiations and arrest the king. Ireton and others worried that the rich people in the House of Commons were going to sell out the poor people in the army by restoring the king to power. Ireton found some support among the officers, but Fairfax, an aristocrat himself, remained steadfastly moderate.
Yeah.
In frustration, Ireton began going around and gathering public support for a long list of radical demands, which included putting the king on trial, abolishing the monarchy, and replacing the House of Commons with something else that better represented England's poor. He was quite successful. Public opinion began to shift, and the idea of putting the king on trial became quite popular, especially with...
And this is extremely unusual. Appealing to the people, forming a popular movement, this is just not done. Politics are supposed to be between the king and his aristocrats. They negotiate over taxes and spending and raising the military, and that's how they work things out. The people are subjects to be taxed and ordered around, basically. And so this is quite a big deal. And like I said, even though in the end, the radicalism of the English Civil War doesn't really work out, and England sort of turns the clock back a little bit, a lot of this radicalism will sort of remain beneath the surface. This idea of freedom and popular sovereignty and independence, and it will pop back up at times throughout British history and countries very much influenced by Britain, such as the United States.
In the army, Fairfax and his moderate allies started to become nervous. After several days of debate, they decided to speed things along by presenting their own list of demands to the king. What they wanted was basically a military dictatorship, with the king's 8-year-old son on the throne as a puppet. Charles did the right thing and flatly turned them down. This was a big deal. Fairfax had just stabbed the negotiators in the back. When news broke, the House of Commons and the army were immediately at each other's throats. Events were moving quickly now. If the House of Commons came after the army, things might devolve into a third civil war.
And as we're seeing, this conflict is often presented as Parliament versus the king. And in many ways it was, but we have other influential forces, the people themselves, and the army. The army who in many ways was representing the interests of the people. Plus, these two factions, the moderates and the independents, that made up, of course, the House of Commons, the Parliament, and also the people as a whole. It's a lot more complex than just Parliament versus King, even though that is sort of the basic outline.
Caught between a rock and a hard place, Fairfax did the politically savvy thing and publicly threw his support behind the radical independents in the House of Commons. The moderates were now caught between the independent minority and the army. They agreed to vote on some of the more radical independent demands, like putting the king on trial, but then they delayed and delayed and delayed again. It quickly became clear that the moderates were playing for time. The negotiators on the Isle of Wight were days from an agreement. On December 1st, Fairfax made his move. A bunch of soldiers showed up on the Isle of Wight with orders to bring the king to the mainland. The negotiators protested, but they had no means to resist. Fairfax had seized the king. On the next day, the army marched on London.
And we can see Fairfax himself is a moderate, but this is about more than just moderate versus independent. There's a lot of power plays going on. Fairfax is playing for his own position, his own power. Of course, he also represents the army, though a lot of the rank and file are more radical than he is. He is the commander-in-chief, so he's sort of making a move on his own.
The House of Commons learned what was happening. The most moderate of the moderates packed up and fled the city.
Wow.
Fairfax had a tiger by the tail here. He was personally a moderate, but his army was out for blood. He believed that if he moved quickly and forced a harsh settlement upon the king, he might be able to save the monarchy. Maybe. If not, the nobility might be next. Revolution was in the air.
Interesting. That's an interesting way of doing things. He sees that the army is more radical than he is, and he doesn't want it to get out of control, so he thinks if he can sort of seize the narrative, impose some harsh consequences on the king, get that done, he can stop the radicals where they are. It's an interesting idea, an idea that's been tried by many people throughout history, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. Let's see how it works out for Fairfax.
Within days, Fairfax had occupied the capital. On the morning of December 6th, a bunch of soldiers, led by a guy named Colonel Thomas Pride, posted up just outside the House of Commons. When members of Parliament started showing up, Pride checked their names against a list and refused to let any of the moderates inside.
Wow.
Things got out of hand pretty quickly. Some of the members tried to force their way into the building, at which point they were arrested by Pride's men and taken away.
Jeez. We're getting some real late Roman Republic vibes right here. A part of the Parliament fleeing, checking names, guarding your legislative building. It's taking me all the way back to the late Roman Republic. Senators fleeing, armed mobs in the streets, popular, organizing, all that kind of stuff.
This event is known to history as Pride's Purge. In total, over 200 members were expelled from the House of Commons, including 45 who were arrested.
Wow.
Many of those who were turned away saw the writing on the wall and fled the city. This new, purged House of Commons was less than half of its original size. People were terrified, and many feared that the purges were not over. In the weeks that followed, most people stopped showing up to the Commons. A legislative body that had once had approximately 500 members now met with sometimes as few as 40.
Jeez.
The army had pulled off a coup d'etat. Critics of this new legislative body called it the Rump Parliament, and the name stuck.
Yep, that is what it is known as today. And, I mean, you can see why. This is a much smaller parliament than the one before, and not that Parliament was ever representative of anything aside from aristocratic interests, but this Parliament is even less representative. So you can see why a lot of people challenge the legitimacy of this Parliament, and its claim to legitimacy is rather weak. Though, in a civil war like this, in this sort of conflict, political chaos, stuff like this can happen. People can seize power and just run with it. I mean, we're basically talking about the army seizing control of the situation. Not fully, but with the Rump Parliament, the Parliament as an institution, at least the institution that it was, has sort of lost a lot of the control here.
But here's the thing. Fairfax did not order Colonel Pride to do this. Pride was acting on Ireton's orders. Fairfax was furious. This was not what he wanted. His plan had backfired.
Yep. So Fairfax goes for the classic preempt the radicals. Try to fulfill their wishes before they can get to it. And like I said, we have a lot of examples of this, and sometimes it absolutely does work. In this case, by doing that, Fairfax seems to have sort of unintentionally encouraged more radical action from his own men in the army. His plan exactly has backfired.
When Cromwell, Fairfax's second-in-command, voiced his support for Pride's purge, Fairfax had no choice but to follow suit. He had effectively lost control of his army.
Yep.
The radicals were running the show now, and they were looking to Cromwell and Ireton for leadership. This new...
Now we sort of see power shift towards Ireton, but in particular towards Cromwell. Fairfax has been a very influential figure in this conflict, and he will be, but now stuff sort of starts shifting to Cromwell, who, like I said, in this entire thing is probably the most influential person, if not for the king himself. But at this point, Cromwell was still second in command. Throughout a lot of the English Civil War, it was more Fairfax calling the shots than Cromwell. Now we start to see how that changes.
Rump Parliament, finally free of moderate influence, immediately got to work. On January 1st, 1649, they passed a bill establishing a new 135-member tribunal called...
It's basically a council representing the radicals. That's what the Rump Parliament is. Of course, a lot less legitimacy than the Parliament prior, though, I will reiterate, it's not like this or the other Parliament was a representative democratic institution. They did not represent the people. It represented the aristocracy, and so you could make an argument that this Parliament, in its radical composition, was more representative of the common people than the prior, more moderate Parliament was. At that point, that's a difficult claim to make, but neither of these bodies is in any way democratically representative, at least not more than a very little amount.
The High Court of Justice. This body would be empowered to put the king on trial, with its members acting as both judges and jury. Fairfax, Cromwell, and Ireton were all appointed to the tribunal, with the rest being split between radical independents from the commons and officers from the army. The legislation also called for a Lord President of the High Court of Justice, who would be responsible for the day-to-day running of the trial. They first went to some of the top legal minds in England, who explained to them that what they were proposing was almost certainly treason.
Yes. And so, if we want to talk about how representative these institutions were, not very, though you could make an argument either way. But if we want to talk about the legality, none of this was very legal at all. This was completely outside the bounds of legality. Now, of course, this is Britain, so everything has to be prim, proper, and legal. They're not going to go all French and just say, damn the law, we'll make our own law, do whatever we want. They want to follow the law, but they're not following the law. Now, of course, legality does not equal morality, This is just the proper way of doing things, but that's quite important to a lot of people. A lot of the average people, of course, but also the king himself, the parliament, a lot of the aristocracy. This is something that is important.
They later found a local judge by the name of John Bradshaw, who openly favored abolishing the monarchy and appointed him to the role. But there was a problem. The House of Lords, which was made up of prominent members of the church and the nobility, refused to ratify the creation of this tribunal.
Yep.
On January 4th.
Now, like I said, neither the House of Commons or the House of Lords is very democratically representative. The Commons is often thought of as more, but that would only occur later down the line. The House of Commons would become more democratically elected. At this point, not very much so. But even at this point, the House of Lords is more representative of a sort of upper aristocracy, the church, more representative of people closer to the king than even the House of Commons is, even considering the House of Commons is primarily an aristocratic body. And so there is separation between these two houses, which of course together make up Parliament.
Fourth, the rump in the House of Commons passed a resolution declaring that all legitimate political power flowed from the people, which meant that the House of Commons had the right to exercise full sovereign authority over all of England.
Right, and so this idea of popular sovereignty, which I think myself and a lot of people would agree with, here is being implemented in a sort of ridiculous fashion. There is a claim here that the House of Commons represents the people of England, and this is a claim that the House of Commons likes to make. But I think from our perspective, we might say, in what way does the House of Commons represent the people of England? It certainly wasn't represented by the people of England, or it certainly wasn't elected by the vast majority of the people of England, right? And so it's kind of a odd thing to say, but you have to remember that this is an idea that was sort of developing. There was a lot of philosophical debates about these sort of ideas, popular sovereignty, and we see a lot of arguments from a lot of philosophers that popular sovereignty doesn't necessarily come from the election of a body by the people, which is sort of how we view it today, but from other things.
Popular sovereignty. Now things were really cooking. According to the Rump Parliament, the House of Lords and the King were politically irrelevant. Anything passed through the Commons became law. When the King learned what the Commons had done, he said in utter disbelief that no law existed under which a king could be charged with a crime. He was right, but it didn't matter. They would put him on trial anyway.
Yeah.
On January 8th, the High Court of Justice met behind closed doors to discuss bringing charges against the king. By now, it was clear that Fairfax had lost control of his army, and from this point forward, he rarely attended meetings. Cromwell was in charge now. King Charles had asked a Scottish army to invade England, and so the tribunal started things off by throwing around the word treason. One member, named Sidney, caused a bit of a panic when he explained to the group that a king could not commit treason because the technical definition of treason was violence against the king.
Right. And so I think from our perspective, sure, what the king did may be considered treason. I mean, violence, warfare against your own people, against your own country, that's absolutely treasonous. Absolutely. But if we look at this time in particular, treason would mean violence, taking up arms against the king. That is the legal definition of treason in this context. And so, if they want to do things legally, properly, then treason doesn't make much sense in this case. Now, I would say that, there's no point even doing things legally, properly, to be honest. They're already past the bounds of legality, but like I said, legality does matter to a lot of these people. And so, or at least the perception of legality matters. And so that's why they're trying to do it from this angle, even though technically it doesn't make much sense.
And even if that wasn't true, the High Court of Justice had been established illegally, without the consent of the House of Lords. Cromwell, when he heard this, burst out in anger. "I tell you, we will cut off his head with the crown on it." Sidney responded, "I cannot stop you, but I will keep myself clean from having any hand in this business." The tribunal pushed forward without Sidney. It was not immediately clear what kinds of crimes a king could be guilty of, and over several days they discussed every conceivable scenario. They considered charging the king with the murder of every person killed over the course of the Civil War. They considered charging him with gross incompetence for the mismanagement of the English Navy. They considered charging him with the murder of his own father, the former king. This was a totally made-up thing, but it was convenient for their purposes because it actually met the technical definition of treason. After agonizing over these questions, the tribunal agreed on a specific set of charges that accused the king of being a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer who sought to subvert the fundamental laws and liberties of the nation. As an olive branch to the moderates, the tribunal agreed to limit themselves to act.
And I think the thing is, this tribunal doesn't necessarily need to adhere to the law. It's already not adhering to the law. What it needs to do is make itself appear legitimate to people who have some degree of power. Now, we might say it needs to make itself appear legitimate to the people, but in this case, the people don't necessarily have the power, though the army does. So it needs to make itself appear legitimate to the army. It's ideally to the king, but that's not going to happen. To the radicals, of course, the moderates, the aristocrats as a whole. The people who have power to do something about it. The issue is that this tribunal is already leaning very strongly towards the radical side of things, and it's only going to get worse from here. So, of course, it's not legal, but that's not even the worst of it. The worst of it is that nobody sees it as legitimate, even beyond the law. If we just look at how people feel about it, it's going to quickly become far too radical for most people in power, most aristocrats, and even a lot of just ordinary people. That's the problem here.
Actual crimes that had taken place during the Civil War. Nothing about the king murdering his own father. These charges hinted at some fundamental questions. Could a king commit treason against his own kingdom? Where did political legitimacy come from? If the people rejected their king, was he still a king?
Right, and so the complicated thing here is that we have a combination of sort of legal, political, social, moral, and philosophical questions, all tied into one. And what I'm saying is, this tribunal absolutely does not have legal legitimacy. So take that out. They need to claim legitimacy elsewhere. Can they do that? Well, no, but we'll see in the next episode if they can.
These questions will be answered with the trial of King Charles I.
Yep. All right. I was gonna let the outro song play a little bit, that classic Historia Civilis outro. I very much enjoyed this one. Like I said, I knew a little bit more about this one than Can Animals Commit Crimes? So I thought this was a good one. Next time we have the trial of Charles I, obviously a continuation. I'm real excited for that. And then after that, we have our last Historia Civilis reaction, Peace, which is actually the lead-up to the Congress of Vienna series. So we probably should have done that before Congress of Vienna, but that's not what we did. So yeah, we're coming to the end of our Historia Civilis reactions. If you want to see all of the channel member and patron exclusive reactions, including the Battle of Agincourt, which will go up probably a couple of weeks from now, then please check out the Patreon, which is linked down below, or channel memberships, which you can find next to the subscribe button. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.